to this breakout session. I'm Jennifer Goforth. I'm the VP of Resource Development at Charles E. Smith Life Communities. I'd like to welcome those of you here with us in the room, and we also have a number of people joining us virtually as well. So welcome to you too. Today we are thrilled to have a wonderful speaker with us, Dr. Deborah Carr. She is a professor of sociology and director of the Center for Innovation in Social Science at Boston University. Dr. Carr has published widely on later life health and family relationships, including more than 100 articles and chapters and several books. Her latest book, Aging in America, was published by the University of California Press in 2023. She is the principal investigator of the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth 1979 and a co-investigator on or advisor to several national surveys of aging. She is the former editor-in-chief of the Journal of Gerontology Social Sciences and current editor-in-chief of Journal of Health and Social Behavior. Dr. Carr received the 2022 Matilda White Riley Distinguished Scholar Award from the American Sociological Association section on Aging and the Life Course. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, CNN, and other media outlets. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Dr. Carr.
Great, well, thank you for that kind and warm introduction. And just a quick check, can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Great, well, it is my pleasure to join you all today and to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is gender and aging. And I always try to make things as conversational as possible. And so if during the talk at any point anybody has a question or comment, we need you to get to that microphone so that our friends who are participating remotely can hear. And if that feels like it interrupts the flow too much, we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A, right? And so I usually try to read an audience. If there are topics I'm talking about that seem like they're not your cup of tea, I'll try to speed along to a topic that is more engaging. But again, it's just a pleasure to be here and talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about. I flew in from Providence this morning, and last night when I was kind of packing and writing down where I needed to go to, I mentioned to my partner, I was like, oh, have you ever heard of Woodmont Country Club? Because even though we're Rhode Islanders, his mother grew up in DC. And he said, my mother's wedding reception was at this country club. My in-laws are 90. They've been married 67 years. So clearly this is a space that leads to marital longevity. So I feel like I have those good forces on my side. But it was actually the surprise that I only learned about last night. So just as a little bit of background. But I am again talking about the joys and struggles of growing older. And no singing and dancing, unfortunately, in my talk. Although if anybody feels compelled, please feel free to get up and do either. And because I am a researcher, I do have lots of data today. But I'll try to enliven the data and really try to bring the statistics that people like me generate to life for you and to make it meaningful for the kind of clients that you work with. And for many of you, some of these facts might resonate with your own lives. So that's just my introduction. So here we go. As an overview, as you can see here, I have three main goals today. The first is to just describe gender differences. How are men and women different along the many dimensions of well-being that make our lives full, from physical health, our emotional health, our social engagement, and then economic well-being, which really is a very important issue. And if anybody falls asleep or has to leave before I'm done, I think one important takeaway is, so even though Social Security is one of the most powerful and effective social programs in recent history, it's not a cure-all. And women are at particular risk of poverty. Women of color, women who are growing old on their own are at a very elevated risk of poverty. And so even though that's not something that I talk about in every single slide, it is an important theme that undergirds so many of these other differences, from everything having to do to loneliness and vulnerability, to elder abuse and exploitation, and to longevity. So I think that's one important point. So we always want to keep some of the economic issues front and center. But then also talking about why. Why do we see these gender differences. And in truth, even though I'm talking about gender differences, I always get a little kind of snarky when you hear things like men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Like, I don't want to reify these differences that men are one way and women are another, because how we behave is entirely social. And one other theme I think that will underlie the talk today is there clearly are generational differences. The way people were raised in the 30s and 40s of kind of the clients that you work with is very different than how boys and girls and gender nonconforming people are raised today. So if I look at Gen X, it's my generation, or millennials behind me, we might not see these stark gender differences as these generations grow older. Everything from housework to earnings capacity to interpersonal style, all these things change over time. So even though we are talking about male-female contrast in a lot of these slides today, we just always want to keep in the back of our head that these differences, of course, change over time, because society and humans are a moving target that continually change. And then finally, Q&A, and we can either have this throughout the talk today, although logistically I have learned that's going to be a little tricky for those of you in the center, and I'll try to ensure that we have plenty of time in the end for you to kind of share what's on your mind as well, and to provide your own insights into some of the patterns that I talk about. So, hopping on that point of this question that you sometimes hear, right, whether it's at a bar or a party or even in the academic literature, who has it worse in old age, or who has it better, men or women? And I often say, like, that's not actually a useful question. Never in life is it a useful exercise to get a tragedy top, to ask who has it worse necessarily. Men and women both have different strains and different challenges that they face. And so as I walk through this talk today and the different dimensions of well-being, you'll see that there are some places whereby men have the advantage, and other dimensions women have the advantage, and our job is to try to figure out why, because that will help us to kind of minimize those differences, and to ensure that if you minimize differences between any two populations, you want it to be because those who are faring worse do better, not where those on the top are coming down, right? So we want to make sure that we can think about ways to make life better for all people. And then the other is that it depends on other factors, right? We often talk about male and female contrast, but in the next slide, two slides up here, you'll see oftentimes in social sciences, we talk a lot about the importance of intersectionality, right? And this comes from a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw. And basically, gender intersects with our other identities. And I know that's very academic-y sounding, but it just means that all of us are male or female, or in some cases, individuals don't identify with either of those categories, but we're so many other things. We have a religious affiliation, a racial or ethnic identity, born in the US, not born in the US, a physical disability that comes on at age 15 or at age 50. All of these things make us who we are, and so gender is certainly one of them, but also there are other factors that we always want to consider. And so that's another reason that kind of makes fuzzy this question of who has it worse. And then just another general theme, often when we talk about kind of gender interactions, or even if you think about who has it worse, older people or young people in today's society, I think another reason these kind of contrasts can be counterproductive is because we never want to view the world as a zero-sum game. Something that's good for one population isn't necessarily good for the other, right? Something that benefits women, for instance, will necessarily benefit the men with whom they are partnered and their children, et cetera. So we also want to just put those topics on the floor. And so when I walk through my talk today, I'll be talking about a lot of different dimensions of well-being, and all of these things can be considered components of successful aging. And this is a concept that I know you are all experts in, given the work that you do. But successful aging is something that has to do with physical health, right? The capacity to move, which is disability, social engagement with life in general, something that we just heard in the prior talk, and then maintaining physical and cognitive functioning, basically doing all those things that one wants to do. And gender powerfully influences all of these different dimensions. And so just to give a couple basic stats here, again, stuff that you may know already, but just a couple of kind of big picture population statistics here. We know that there are many more women than men among the older population, age 65 plus. And this is just kind of a helpful little tool that demographers use to understand aging population. It's called the population pyramid. And is this something anybody seen before, population pyramid? Anyone? You have, yeah. For a lot of you, this is review, and this is just a really simple snapshot to help us understand what proportion of people in our population are each age, from children to adults, and then what proportion are men versus women. And one important thing is as we move from the bottom to the top, we'll see that these pyramids become increasingly lopsided, right? We have many more women at older ages, and that's because men die younger, something that we will talk about. But these population pyramids also tell us something else that's important. And this is something that you can see in the 2060, which is on the right, as opposed to the 2020, which is on the left. It helps us to understand what the future population will look like. And again, and this is a point I'm not going to dig into in particular depth, but it is something that pertains to all of you in the future of your work and your younger mentees who work in your field, which has to do with the number of people who will likely need long-term care in the future, right? If you look in 2060, the top is very heavy. That means the overall share of our US population, where people are aged 60, 65, 70 and older, are really wide bars. And partly that's because the millennials are among the largest generations in recent history. In a couple mere decades, they will be reaching later life. So this is, again, all these bars here tell us that our population is getting older. It's getting older very rapidly. And as we reach those older age groups, women dramatically outnumber men. And that just helps us to think about what the future of the base of clients that many of you work with will look like. And so that leads us to, again, moving away from the big population at a more individual level. So there's a dramatically skewed or imbalanced sex ratio. And so what most of you see, for those of you who are working in the kind of direct care space, there are a lot more women in every room than there are men, right? You see this all the time, right? And it's not your imagination, it's just sheer demography. Okay, that's a picture that's familiar to all of you. Here are just some bar charts here, and this tells you the ratio in 2020 of how many women there are how many men there are per women. So if it was an even world, it would be 100 men per every 100 women. Here you can see among people ages 0 to 17, young people, there are actually more men, right? 104 men per 100 females. But then it drops down a lot because teenage boys take more risks. Teenage boys are more likely than teenage girls to die of things like accidents. So that kind of pulls the ratio down. It looks about even, right, 18 to 64. But then it starts dropping dramatically. And so by the time we get to a population 85 plus, it's 56 to 1, right? So women are almost outnumbering men by, 2 to 1. And so that's something that really matters, right? So it essentially means that working with older populations is overwhelmingly working with female populations. And that's something, again, that most of you know from your daily lives. But again, here are just some numbers here to kind of confirm what you observe in your daily life. So why is that? Why are there so many more women than men? Very straightforward answer. And this is where we start to get into that question of kind of who has it worse and why. Men die younger than women. This is something that we all know. This is kind of a sad fact. Here's a chart here that hopefully you can see, but this arrays every state in the United States and talks about how many years do women outlive men. So what is the female advantage in terms of longevity here, or the male disadvantage? District of Columbia, which is right by here, is among the very worst. It's 7. Then I tried to find states that are near you, or most of you probably work Maryland, Virginia. So it's 6 years, 5 years. So this is something persistent in every single state. Utah has the lowest at 3.9. Does anybody want to take a guess as to why Utah has actually a very tiny gender gap in survival? Less women? Nope. Part of the reason why men and women have kind of similar lifespans in Utah relative to everywhere else is Utah is a really interesting state demographically. 70% of the population is LDS or Mormon. And part of their religious guidelines, I'm not sure if that's a proper word, are things like no alcohol, no smoking, no drinking excessively. And those are things that for older generations, men did more than women. Right? And so if you take away those risk factors, that's kind of an equalizer. If you look at kind of many of the other states where people didn't have prohibitions on kind of smoking, drinking, fast cars, fast women kind of scenario, those risk factors were kind of pulled away from men who disproportionately engaged in some of those behaviors. And so that helps to minimize that risk. I suspect this is going to change over time, and that's something that we can kind of talk about. There are some predictions that that gender gap in mortality will narrow over time. But it might not be a good news scenario. It might be because women are doing worse, and that's something that we'll talk about in the next slide. There we go. So why do men die younger, an average of 6 to 7 years? And you see that gap for Blacks, for Hispanics, and it even the bigger gap slightly for Native Americans. So this is something that is pretty persistent across all racial and ethnic groups. And so why do we see that? Well, there's some biological factors. Some of you probably have a much deeper knowledge of biology than I do, because I am a social scientist. But estrogen has biological advantages for longevity. Even though it might not always feel that way when you're experiencing, it does indeed have protective effects. But the other really has to do with social behavior. And if you look at the statistical studies that kind of try to decompose, right, how much of this gap is due to biology versus social, overwhelmingly it's due to social factors. But the good news of that is that it can be changed. So if there were risk factors out there that are shortening some people's lives versus others, these are things that can be changed over time. And so one factor is that men have a greater risk of cardiovascular disease than women do. And why is that? Well, again, a lot of it has to do with things like physical stress, emotional stress, something I'll talk about in a moment, having fewer sources of emotional support, feeling less comfortable reaching out for that emotional support, keeping anger pent up. These are things that really can have a tremendous bearing on physical health. So here we have kind of those social factors. Men of the generations that are currently older were much more likely to work in physically dangerous jobs. We know that farming is a physically dangerous job. Working in coal mining, anything that works with dangerous materials, right? And we don't see so much of that for the younger generations, but that certainly is a factor that affects life expectancy. Men historically have also engaged in more risky behaviors, smoking, drinking, meat and potatoes as opposed to salad, greater risk-taking. One interesting finding is kind of going less often for regular checkups, things like stress tests. Women are just know that you're supposed to get a checkup every year. Men don't always get that kind of checkup or screening. And again, and this is not anything that's an attack on men. Think about what men's lives were like in the 50s and 60s, right? Of the older men that many of you care for. If they were the sole breadwinner, meaning the sole earner of the household, they didn't have the luxury to take time off to go to the doctor if they felt it was going to take them away from earning and supporting their families. Some might not have access to care. There's some interesting data done in a study by a former colleague of mine that shows that men who most agree with statements like men should be strong, they shouldn't acknowledge their feelings, those are the ones who are least likely to go to the doctor because they view it as kind of a sign of weakness that you have to go for these checkups. That's a troubling thing, but it also means it can change. If we can expand our ideas about what masculinity and femininity are to make people feel like, yeah, it's being a good protector to actually take care of one's health, right? That's something that can be helpful to future generations. Then again, that not reaching out for social support. So these are a lot of the social reasons why it is that we do see these persistent gender gaps in longevity, and especially for heart disease. And I'm happy to share these slides through email if anybody would like them at a later time. So that's the bad news for men, but if we go to the flip side there, women are living longer, but this is something that many of you see. Are they living healthier? And because women do outlive men by so many years, they also are at greater risk of more health problems because we know that the health problems increase with each passing year. Right? And so this is just one bar chart that's an example. This is the proportion of people ages 65 and older who report that they have a limitation with sight, hearing, mobility, walking around, communication or speech, cognition, and self-care. And for everyone, even though the differences are small, women are at greater risk of each of these conditions relative to men, except for the one difference, which is hearing. right? Some people joke when you see this stat, men pretend that their hearing is limited because they're tired of listening to people talk all the time. I suspect there's some biological component, but then another goes back to those jobs earlier, right? Repeated exposure to things that are loud, right? Using a power drill, et cetera. Those types of things can minimize one's hearing. So women are living longer, but they do have these higher rates of impairment across a whole range. And these obviously are linked to, again, women's advanced age. So now we can turn to mental health. Again, I'm zipping through lots of topics, so we will have time to get back to them later. Women in any survey you look at, whether it's girls, whether it's middle-aged women, whether it's older women, women report higher levels of depressive symptoms. Things like I felt sad, blue, I lost interest in most things I like to do. This is a persistent finding that we have had in survey data across time. Women are twice as likely as men to be depressed, also come out a bit higher on things like anxiety disorder, right? Being nervous all the time. But be that as it may, look at suicide. Men dramatically outpace women in terms of suicide risk here. And these are suicide rates. You don't need to dig into all the numbers specifically, but the main thing is that the blue bars are consistently higher than the blackish bars here. I guess it's navy versus bright blue here. And you can see it's dramatically higher. And it's age 75 plus, it is way, way higher. And if you break this down by race and ethnicity, this is driven almost solely by white men. And this has been kind of a persistent question. Why is it that older white men have a dramatically higher rate of suicide than every other population? There's a large rural component to this. This tends to be in what I call the big empty states out west. A lot of it is access to means, is kind of the jargony term. Access to firearms, right? Women, when they attempt suicide, it tends more often to be medications and pill overdoses. For men, it often is firearms. And there's a lot of interesting and really quite distressing work on this, which underscores, again, kind of health policy and mental health policy. Also is gun control policy in one way, and I'm not making any political points on that. I know it's a hot button topic, but these statistics are very jarring, and they have been persistent over the past couple of decades here. So men, again, have higher risk of suicide. Here, again, this is just a point to come back to one of the earlier points I made about intersectionality here. We've been talking in general about men and women, but across pretty much every physical health outcome, you see a racial gap, right, where blacks and Hispanics have higher rates of just about every major cause of death than whites. And that is a topic for 7 additional talks. I don't want to give it short shrift here, but it does underscore this point about intersectionality. And even though I'm talking about age 65 plus populations, whatever patterns we see happening among older adults don't magically crop up on their 65th birthday, right? These are the outcomes of things, an accumulation of risks and advantages that people have had since birth. Do they have access to healthy food when they are young? Do they have access to schooling and good jobs that will bring them health insurance and allow them to live in healthy neighborhoods that don't have toxics in the air, for instance? And so this is another factor, again, that on the whole, right, we talked about women's health tends to be poorer, men tend to die younger, but we see tremendous gaps in race and ethnicity in pretty much every outcome, except for a couple. One is skin cancer, where whites have a higher risk of mortality. The other is suicide that we just talked about. Whites have dramatically higher suicide rates, and Native Americans, right, given, again, just tremendous oppression of Native American communities and access to alcohol and firearms, right, given some of the places that they live in. So again, this whole theme that we're talking in general about men and women, but we also want to keep these other dimensions, right, on our radar. So that's kind of some of the gloomy stuff. I'm going to try to talk about some happier stuff as well, and then make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. Some of that stuff might not particularly bear on your daily life, right? You focus more on maybe the individuals and what their relationships are like and who is visiting them and who do they have in terms of their social support. So now I'm going to talk just a little bit about family life. What does family life look like on average for men and women, and what are the pros and cons, and what are the benefits that they experience here? So one thing that, again, many of you know here, men are way more likely than women to be married at every age. And there's a lot going on in these charts here, but a couple things should jump out. right? The left panel is men, right panel is women, and then you'll see what proportion are currently married, are widowed, are divorced, or have never married. And as you can see here, at every age, women are more likely to be widowed. Right? That's not a great surprise because of the life expectancy difference we just talked about. Men are more likely to be married, right? They're both about equally likely to get divorced, but which one do you think is more likely to get remarried or repartnered? Men. Why? Partly it's preference, right? There's interesting data that older women, sometimes they don't necessarily want to remarry. They want to date. They want to have a relationship called living apart together, which means you go steady. I mean, it could be your partner of 20 years that you spend all your time with, but you have his and her homes. And there's a phrase that men want someone to come home to, and women want someone to go out with. They want to socialize, but you just want to come home to your own space. And I see some chuckling that may resonate with some of you. Another reason why men are more likely to remarry if they're divorced or widowed, right? They can hop back into that married category. It's supply side, to put it very coarsely. Remember all those sex ratios you saw earlier? That's another reason why. And on average, even though we don't like this, people still tend to maintain these age boundaries. And men, the data show pretty convincingly, have a preference for a younger partner. And it doesn't go away, right? If they're 65, they don't necessarily want someone 68 on average. It would be more like 50. And so that makes it very difficult for women over 65 or heck, even over 55 to find a male partner for marriage. And so that's where those ratios that seem really boring at the beginning come back and actually affect people's lives in a real way. And so this is part of the reason, something we'll talk about, thinking about needs for social support. We need to expand our boundaries, that for some individuals, they might not want a romantic partner. They might not have access to a romantic partner. I know from lecturing often in nursing homes, as we talked about earlier, it's kind of like junior high. I have heard women residents sit around and say, well, why does all the two men in this home, they all like this one woman here? What's so great about her? And it was like junior high again. But this notion of scarcity somehow drives these very interesting dynamics. And it does kind of bring us back to the point about thinking about relationships broadly. And when people need social connection, we need a broad bucket of types of relationships that can make people's lives fuller. If there are some particular types of relationships that are just demographically out of reach, to put it in a very coarse manner, right? If you have 10 women, 2 men, right, that is not going to lead to 10 romantic partnerships that are exclusive, which tends to be what people want at any age, right? And so we have relationships, and that we have it or we don't, but we shouldn't talk about just marriage or dating as this end-all or be-all. It's not just a status. There are quality differences, right? And so now I'll just talk a little bit about what do we get in our relationships. And so we talk a lot about social support. You heard a lot about social support this morning, and that is clearly a key takeaway. Social relationships matter. But we need to recognize that not all social relationships are good. Some social relationships are ambivalent. So a relationship can be very loving, but it can still get under your skin. And so that's something that I'm just going to touch on real quickly with these 2 slides that have a lot going on, but I'll make the message clear to you. These are just a couple papers I've done, and the question here was, when you look at older adults who have significant disability, is it really helpful and protective to them when they have high levels of family support or not, right? And we would all think, yeah, when your health is really bad, that's exactly when you need the social support. That's when it's going to be most protective. So that's what this slide here shows you. Over here, this is sadness, right? And here, these different lines are for women who are married versus formerly married, right? And then this shows you how much social support they have down here. And so you'll notice that there's one line here that's really a steep dip. See this? All the way down there. This is a very particular subgroup. This is formerly married women who are kind of on their own. They don't have a partner. And Q4 means that their disability scores are the highest quartile. So these are divorced women in very poor health. So you can think about those at greatest need. For these women, for every 1 point increase in family support, the more supportive families they have, their sadness just disappears. So this shows for women who are facing, again, a lot of adversity on their own, high disability, the more social support they get, their sadness levels just drops tremendously. And there's a quote I've seen that for women, they view social support as actually a way to be independent and autonomous. It helps them to do what they need to do. For men, it's kind of a different story. This next slide here is kind of a similar theme, and there's a lot going on here too. Here, I changed the outcome. I'm not looking at sadness anymore, but frustration. And frustration is that feeling that you feel when you want something and you just can't get it, right? And so whether it's getting up a flight of stairs or putting money in a soda machine and having no soda come out, you're just frustrated and angry. So it's a really important outcome, frustration. Here, you'll notice that there is one bar here. So you have 3 bars that are kind of going down the hill. You have 1 bar going up the hill, this one here. This is the category that I find really interesting. This red dotted bar are men here who are, we switched this here, these are the men who are in very poor health. Men in very poor health, the more social support they get from their spouse, the more frustrated they are. And so think about that. You have a man, he's an older man, he has a high level of impairment, so doing things, getting up the stairs, feeding, bathing are just really hard to do. The more his wife helps him, the more frustrated he gets. And first, as you might know if you are a researcher, whenever we have a finding that's counterintuitive, it's clearly I must have done something wrong. You go back to your data, you go back to your code. And like, no, the more I thought about this, you have an older man, as he starts to feel that his capacities are more limited, being helped is something that's viewed as either infantilizing, emasculating, something that feels like it's affirming that you can't do the things that you've done the prior 75 years. And this led us to make these kind of conclusions that all social support is not necessarily good. Social support that isn't wanted or that is delivered in kind of a ham-fisted way, this kind of my way or the highway, or even there's something called suffocation in relationships, that if you love too much, you try to help too much. I'm probably guilty of this. You know, my partner just had surgery, and every 5 minutes, can I get you something else to eat or drink? And it was like, please just leave me alone. And we know that's actually fairly common. And so this has to do with kind of regulating how one gives help, thinking about what would work for the person who is receiving it, and kind of getting a sense of how independent versus dependent one wants to be when they're in that care receiving position. So I don't deny the point, social support is good, but we want to ask, how are we delivering? What does the recipient think of as social support as opposed to what we think of as social support? And that can help us to kind of interact in a more smooth manner. So that's one thing about relationships that we have, kind of the quality of them. Now we can talk about the fact that, again, not all people are married. Not all of them stay married. And here, this just kind of gives you another lens on relationships here. This is revisiting a point I made earlier, but there are all different types of relationships. And a lot of different policies still privilege the currently married relationship. But this is the slide again, just to get some food for thought here. This is a population of older adults, and look how many different categories you see here. There are lots and lots of different ways that older adults are partnered. And this might, again, bear on you, especially those who work in long-term care, that they're coming from very different places. And even though overwhelmingly, older people, again, as I talked about earlier, men more than women are more likely to be continually married, you still have older people making all these different kinds of marital transitions. Some might be cohabiting outside of marriage and then marry. There might be some who remarry. And so there's just, again, tremendous variety again. So when we work with older adults, we want to know not only what is the quality of their relationship, but things like what is the duration of their marriage, right? Given that remarriage and cohabitation, repartnering rates are surprisingly high among the baby boom cohort moving forward, sometimes it's helpful to actually get a sense of how long one's relationship has been. Because this bears on another point I'll touch on in a moment. Every time an older person forms a new marriage or cohabitation or a living apart relationship, what does that often bring? Stepkids, right? Or other relatives. And we often know these other relatives may either try to really get engaged in care or keep at arm's length, or they might want to fly in at the 11th hour when an end-of-life decision is made. And so often, though, we think about older adults as being one marriage for life. They married their sweetheart, like my in-laws. They were married for 70 years. That is decreasingly true. Right? And in fact, some statistics show that about 1/3 of all older adults today are in a second or higher order marriage, which means that they have kids from a first marriage who have known them since birth, right? They have kids from a second marriage. Those kids from the second marriage might not want to engage in the care. That's what the data show, that stepkids actually help a little bit less, or they might want to be really engaged, or they might not like the new spouse, for instance, and so you have to navigate that as well. And so there's a lot going on in the slide here, but I think the main takeaway is that there's just tremendous variety in the kind of relationships that older adults have, and for each new generation of old people, from boomers to Gen X, as they enter old age, they might look like it's just a long-term married couple, but they will have many more kind of differences than the very, very long-term married people with the one marriage. And that does create difficulties for care and care decisions, because there is oftentimes that too many cooks scenario with the new kids, or in some cases they might appear to have legal relatives who just don't particularly want to engage. So that's more in this category of kind of heterogeneity of older adults' relationships. So we've talked a little bit about marriage. Like I said, I'm going through a lot of different topics, and then in the Q&A in a few moments we can dig more deeply into any of them. We've been talking about married people, what happens in marriage, what happens in remarriage. Now we're going to transition to widowhood, which is a marital status category that accounts for a large number of older adults, and especially older women. I suspect that widowhood is a challenge that you see in many of the people that you work with, and it's very hard, you know, whether someone was married 2 years or 72 years, it's among the most stressful transitions that one goes through. And so this is a big area of my research, trying to figure out what helps older people to cope well and not so well with loss. And I could talk about this again for 3 additional talks. One message I always try to convey is that not all widowed people are depressed. Not all widowed people are sad. Why is that? For reasons you've seen. If your spouse was suffering for a long time, their death actually is a sign of relief that they're no longer suffering. The other that sometimes they don't want to talk about, but they will tell a researcher who's kind of anonymous, they're never going to see us again. Remember those slides earlier about not all marriage is good marriage? Some people have really bad marriages. And I will often have someone come up to me in secret say to their grandmother the best day of their life was the husband's funeral because they had been mistreated, or vice versa. You know, there are a number of older adults who stayed in marriages that were not healthy for them. And so widowhood isn't necessarily the sign of tremendous sorrow, but it's a feeling of relief that a very troubling and oppressive and perhaps abusive marriage has ended. It's a clear minority of cases that are in those categories, but it's always important just to underscore that some widowed people will not be particularly grief-stricken, and it's because reactions to spousal death are really a function of what that relationship was like all those prior years. And that's, I think, an important theme that many of you probably know. But if someone doesn't appear to be grieving upon the death of their spouse, it doesn't mean they're pathological. It doesn't mean they're incapable of feeling. It doesn't mean that they misunderstood what happened. It just means that perhaps the passing wasn't as traumatizing to them as one might have thought otherwise. So that's a majority of cases. But when you go to, the minority of cases. For most, it is a very distressing transition. And what are the things that older people do to cope with this? Here, this is just some data from a study I published a couple years ago based on a national survey of widowed people. And there might be just some little tips in here that help to figure out what helped people to do well. And so this asked older men and women who had lost a spouse, what are some of the things that you did when your spouse died to help you cope with the loss, to help you kind of manage the pain a bit? And as you can see, there were some things that were very, very common. One is positive recollection. And I think that's really important for those of us who work with older adults. Oftentimes we're afraid to talk about the death or talk about the decedent because you think it's going to upset them. They know he died. When you have a family member who dies young, you know they died. When other people ask about it, it doesn't make you sad. It actually gives you a forum to talk about him. And so over here, this is something really helpful, remembering the good times, engaging in conversations about what were the high points of your marriage, what did you enjoy most, what do you miss most. It's not sad, actually. It helps them to manage. And likewise, another really common one here was to think about the current good things that are happening. For some people, turning to religion matters. For women, much more so than men. And this is consistent with a lot of the literature showing women are more spiritual. Women are the ones who play often a larger role in their child's educational, religious education, for instance. So for women, often they will talk more in spiritual terms than men will. But the positive recollections are a really important one here. For men, there's a little bit of that just keeping busy, right? Just engaging in a hobby, seeing one's friends, going to religious services, but keeping busy or distraction. Again, that's something down here. Men like to get out of the house. Women like to find activities. Here, there's one more that men do much more than women here, and it's do things to feel closer to spouse. That's things like visiting the grave, even looking at pictures, looking at photo albums. And there used to be a belief in kind of the bereavement literature that if you were kind of hanging on too much to the decedent, that it was unhealthy. If you're still wearing your ring, if you're keeping their clothes in the closet, if you have photos of your late spouse all over. It was viewed as something that was stopping you from getting on with your life. Now the kind of research has pointed to those are good things. It's called continuing bonds. And that's exactly what these guys here are doing things to feel close to your spouse. It doesn't mean you're not dating. It doesn't mean you're not getting on with your life, but it just means that you are in a healthy way acknowledging that this person was a tremendous part of your life. So talking about the late person, holding on to one of their prized possessions, has gone from being viewed as not adaptive coping, maybe 30 years ago, in the research today, kind of a good thing. Again, provided that the person recognized that, yes, the death did happen, you can continue to bond with this person, engage in those memories, but we still want you to engage in the world, right, outside of your home. So that's a bit more about, do men and women cope better? No, there's no one does better than the other. There is one finding where men do worse, though. In terms of mental health, it's about the same. Women tend to have more friends to talk to because they have peers, right? One of the most effective widowhood interventions is the widow-to-widow program, which matches widows with more experienced widows that they can talk. And so emotionally, women tend to have a bit more on the social support side because it's more common. Men tend to have more physical health reactions, right? You might have heard of the broken heart, dying of a broken heart phenomenon where the spouses die in very close proximity. This is something that we all read about in the paper and we find it actually very emotional and very touching. Oh, they died 2 days apart. It's because they loved each other so much. That's not actually the main explanation for it. The main explanation often is that one spouse was the caregiver, and they were so busy caring for their spouse, they skipped their doctor's appointments, they didn't take their medication, and then they die shortly thereafter. Not of a broken heart, but whatever condition they had that they were not paying attention to. And so I think that's another kind of practical takeaway message here, that the one who is the healthier spouse might not be the healthier spouse for long if they're making a lot of caregiving sacrifices. And you hear this a lot. Well, my husband has dementia, and so for me it's just a little bit of a chest pain. I'm not going to worry about it. But that's part of the reason why you see often the apparent dying of a broken heart. One other interesting area where men do worse, men do tend to die more quickly after their wife dies, but the research shows it's not of all causes. It's only causes that are very closely linked to health behaviors. So having a wife die increases a man's risk of death from heart disease in particular, from cirrhosis, from those diseases that are very tightly linked to health behaviors. And it's because historically in marriages, women are the ones who monitored the diet and gave them reminders to go to the doctor. So again, that's kind of another place that after a wife dies, men often do need more help with keeping up with the medication regimen, making sure they eat the 3 square meals a day, because in many marriages that had this kind of particular gender division of labor, it was the women doing more of that kind of medication and food and exercise control. So this here, we're talking about relationships so far, but now it's important to touch on the fact that not everybody has relationships. And I'm not going to say much about this because I learned this morning that you heard a lot about this. Social isolation, meaning those people who are alone. This is something that Murthy, right, our Surgeon General talked about last week, right? In the United Kingdom, social isolation or being alone is considered such a major social problem that they actually appointed a minister of loneliness, right? This was about 5 years ago, so they're a bit ahead of the curve. There's a lot to say about this topic, but I think, again, the main takeaways are being alone and feeling alone are different things, exactly as you heard on that earlier talk. And so men are more likely to have a romantic partner, but they're less likely to have close ties with their children, particularly in the case of divorce. They tend to have a greater likelihood of being estranged. So divorced men sometimes have very problematic ties with the children from their prior marriage. Women, again, as you just heard, are less likely to have a romantic partner, but are much more likely to have support from their children. Just underscoring a point, these are the two different ways to be lonely. Social is you just don't have enough people, social loneliness, but then emotional loneliness is very different. Someone can be surrounded by friends and family or their roommate in a long-term care facility, and they can still feel alone. And so this is, I think, the important thing to diagnose. And we often measure emotional loneliness with things like, I feel no one understands me. There's no one around that I can really share my fears with. That feeling of being misunderstood, of not fitting in. That is the one that actually is really problematic because it's hard to detect. Someone might look like they have a spouse and children, but they might not be providing that kind of emotional acceptance, right? That they're, the one who's kind of serving the food historically, but they're not engaging in that dinner time conversation. And in fact, one saddest statistic is 1 in 3 married older adults report some emotional loneliness. Oftentimes it's when you have an unhealthy spouse and you can't have these heart-to-heart conversations and you don't feel heard. But again, it's just underscoring that point that having someone doesn't necessarily mean being heard. So that's social isolation. I think I'm going to skip through some of the economic stuff here just so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. But I'll just do 2 other points to get the conversation going. Ageism. This is another challenge of old age. Ageism, people talk down to you. They use elder speak. I'm sure you all know that. How are you today, young lady? When the young lady is a very educated woman who's 80 years old. And that's something that happens all the time. Women are more likely to be subject to ageism at every age. This is a major problem for women who are the young old, those 55 to 64, who often need to go back to work or increase their work hours. There is tremendous discrimination against older women in the labor force because we know there's a very high priority placed on youthful beauty. A lot of different studies, I could give you a ton of them, but even though all older workers are less likely to be hired and called back for interview in studies, twice as many obstacles for women as for men, especially in jobs that are outwardly facing. So that's something that is really an important issue. I think we're going to now try to focus on some positives before we go to the Q&A. We're going to talk about a lot of struggles here. There are other topics, elder abuse issues that I know many of you are familiar with, poverty. There are a lot of these major social problems that affect men and women in slightly different ways, but none are immune. But I do just want to end with a couple of positive things here, and then we can just have some conversation in our last few minutes. So this is a very well-known curve. Maybe you've seen these age, life satisfaction, age happiness curves. The worst age in life to be is roughly where I am sitting now, middle age. Middle age, any survey you look at, that is the point in life where happiness scores look the lowest, life satisfaction looks the lowest, right? And it goes up over time. And if I stretch this out, it starts to diminish a bit at the very older ages when people start to have very significant physical and cognitive health problems. But you do actually see happiness goes up as people get older. And why is that? Well, one answer that is less happy is statistical artifact. Those older adults who were sad, who had really downtrodden, awful lives, they died before they turned 70, 80, 90. But there are some other reasons beyond statistical artifact. And you might see this. You might be marveling at someone who has so much adversity, but who still seems to put a positive face on things. Why is that? Older adults have cognitive processes and social processes that they just see things in a more positive light. And it's not delusion. I mean, that's an infantilizing approach, is, oh, they don't notice. No, that's not actually true. One is that there's older adults are kind of selective about their social ties for the most part. Just think about your social ties. You have a lot of people. You have work colleagues and neighbors. You might not like them, but you still spend time with them. Older adults really, by choice, shrink down who they spend their time with. And they focus on those people who are most meaningful, the immediate family members, those that they like, and they discard those ties that are less uplifting. They don't have to deal with coworkers who they dislike anymore. And so by being selective in who they spend their time and emotional energy on, that's uplifting. You're surrounding yourself with your favorite people. Another good news is there's something called emotional reactivity, which is basically just how riled up we get about things. That declines with age. So if you think about the romantic breakup you had at 13 that made you absolutely devastated, and at 45 it had you very, very upset. When someone's 75 or 80, when bad things happen to them, of course it is disturbing, but it doesn't lead to the emotional lows or highs because emotional reactivity minimizes. And partly it's biology, but it's partly, you know, if you have weathered all these challenges over time, something bad may happen, it might make you sad, but you actually know that you will get through it and you know it's not the end of the world. So that kind of more modest reactions to things helps to keep the good mood. Another is cognitive processing. There's a lot of really interesting work on this. You will bring a mother and daughter into a lab and you will induce an argument. You ask them afterwards what happened. The mother's like, yeah, we had a little spat, it's all fine. And the daughter will say, we had this really bad argument. And the older folks look at it and are not as critical. They're like, you know, it just managed to roll with the punches. And that's something that really helps to maintain the happiness. Getting back to the whole point of earlier, picking your battles, really not sweating the small stuff, that absolutely happens with age. And then finally, wisdom, right? With all those years, this capacity to find meaning, to prioritize the most important things in life, and to being able to adopt this kind of big picture view and putting things into perspective is an absolute gift that comes with age, and it's something that men and women kind of possess in equal parts and in equal forms. And I think those are some really important positive takeaways for the reasons why happiness increases with time. So I think in the interest of time, I'm happy to share slides with you, but I want to make sure that we have at least a good 10 to 13 minutes for questions. So thank you for listening on this kind of whirlwind tour. If there's any topic you want to talk about or share about, please step right up to the microphone. And likewise, if there are questions from those who are participating remotely, we will get them from the chat. So anything you want to disagree with? Thank you. Any questions? Or any comments? Anything you want to disagree with? Anything you hated? That makes it more fun.
It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. We learned a lot.
Oh, thank you. And so if anyone has a question, would you mind either speaking to the mic or saying it and I'll repeat it back so the folks on Zoom can hear?
Yes. Did I hear you say that it could be problematic to greet someone your age or older as young lady or young man?
Yes, so his question for folks on the Zoom, is it problematic to greet a person older than you as young lady or young man? There actually is a academic literature on this called elder speak. And so it's using kind of this sing-song tone, like, and how are you today? And don't we look pretty? It actually has been shown to lead to a bit of sadness among older people, and they start to behave more dependently, because that's kind of the tone we would use in speaking to a child in some cases. And we recognize it's not as dire as not hiring someone for a job, but it still feels demeaning to be spoken to in that way, even if it's coming from a well-intended place, because an 85-year-old knows she's not a young lady. And sometimes she knows she does not look pretty today. And so just talking to an 85-year-old or a 90-year-old, exactly as we would talk to a 45-year-old, maybe upping the volume if we need to, right? Or speaking more slowly if we need to, and then talking head on in case anybody's partially reading lips because of hearing impairment. But most of the experts would say that we need to just kind of curb our elder speak. It's kind of like if we're talking to someone for whom English is a second language and we talk really loudly and slowly, it doesn't need to be done. So that would be my recommendation.
Can I have a follow-up?
Absolutely.
Considering my southern roots, is it impolite to address a woman as, good morning, ma'am? Ma'am?
Yes. So the question is, especially if you're coming from the South where the word ma'am is used, it's impolite to use ma'am. I would say no, not at all. I think because they are a ma'am or sir or madam, whatever term you're going to use, because it's not key to age. And I think the reason that the research finds it problematic to say, how are you, young lady, is because they know they're not young. Right? And so it just seems like it's infantilizing. However, if someone has exchanged with one person and they seem to enjoy it, who am I to judge that exchange? I'm just kind of going by what the data show based on the reports of the older adults who did have a negative reaction to that type of speech. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Great.
A while back, I worked with a nurse in the emergency department who was probably in her 60s at the time. I was younger. And I remember, I don't know what led us to this, but she said the hardest part about being older is you're invisible. And I didn't understand that at the time, even though I wasn't that much younger. But I do now. And I wanted to just talk about that for women in the workplace, educated, certified, and that they're really not, when I was a young nurse, I used to look to my older, colleagues for guidance or questions, and I find that as an older person in the workplace, I don't see that as much, but my role's different too, so.
Yeah, that's a great question, kind of the feeling of invisibility among older women.
Yeah.
And this is something we do hear a lot about, even interpersonally. The one vignette you often hear is when you're younger, people always make comments when you're walking down the street, and you really dislike it. But then you wake up one day and no one said anything? And but in the workplace, that's also true, because I think people presume that older women don't have the knowledge base they have because of these persistent stereotypes. And I'll give kind of one vignette where I made a major mistake. I was at a family Seder, and there was a much older woman there who was a friend of the family, who must have been about 90. And I kind of helped her out of her chair, and I'm thinking, oh, what a sweet older woman. And someone came up to me and said, she has 6 patents. She was one of the original scientists at Bell Labs. And I was like, oh my God, I made that mistake, seeing a much older woman. And partly it's because we know in past generations, women had obstacles in the workplace and they weren't professionals. And I think that stereotype has persisted. And I think our message is just to take everyone at face value and assume that every single person is different, and learn about how did they find this career path and what is their job, and recognizing that longevity in the labor force leads to tremendous deep knowledge, right? Seeing a profession change over time. But you do see that in a lot of professions today. I think another point of the invisibility is younger people expect everything quickly, and they place a very high premium on technological knowledge. And so if you have a coworker who doesn't do Twitter, who isn't the fastest on the computer, they won't recognize years of experience with personnel management or research expertise or caregiving expertise. And I think one important point is, in this era when there's so much emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion training, which is absolutely important for racial and ethnic and gender orientation equity, we need to bring age into the forefront and let young workers know that someone 45 is not obsolete. Recognizing ageism in language and in how we interact to squash that invisibility. But a great question and a great observation. Thank you. So we have 1 minute now. Who has a great question?
You mentioned how males, when they need assistance, can become more depressed or don't feel well.
Yeah.
So for family caregivers who are taking care of an older adult male, what are some techniques you could do to still help them with their daily activities, but also be aware of how they're feeling?
Yeah, that's a great question. How to provide care to a man with health problems who might not want the care. I think one is doing what you can to help him feel autonomous, right? And you're the expert in how to give the care, but maybe kind of asking, like, what do you think would be helpful for you? And kind of, even if it's something that you have to do, maybe giving them two options, right? And options that for you would be equally effective. So at least there's some input there. Because in some cases, right, it's not possible to say, no, I don't want any care. You have to do your job. And so I think that would be it, kind of asking for a bit of their input. And then the larger, which is kind of a larger lesson, a lot of these kind of engaging in conversation about, oh, can you tell me a little bit about, when you're engaging in idle conversation, about what was something you were really proud of in your work life or in your family life? And that way they get to kind of display that identity where they were independent, autonomous, and kind of their best possible self. Because when people are not healthy, they don't feel their best possible self, and that can lead to some of that frustration. Right, so I hope that helps. And I know we're just about at 11:30. I'm happy to linger and chatter afterwards if anybody has questions. But thank you for being an engaged audience today. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carr. That was really so interesting. So much great information. Thank you. And I want to let you all know that we have a break until 11:45, and then there will be 2 more breakout sessions. The one that has to do with physical activity and the benefits of physical activity will be in this room at 11:45, and the one that is focused on LGBTQ elders will be in the pre-function room. Thank you.
Good to meet you guys in person. Yeah, we really work hard at it. So, yeah. And you guys too.
It really shows. Actually, I had a caregiver ask me the other day, who's the other agency you were talking about? She overheard me talking. This is a client with 2 or 3 agencies. I was mentioning your name and how it all happened, and I happened to mention that they're a little more high-end and more in the care. Tell me that agency. I'm gonna finder's fee.
Oh, well, that's good to know. We are. They do still with the talk.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right there. I'm going to grab my water. Yes. Here we go. And there's, oh shoot, I think they've both been open, so I will move on.
Okay.
Get to your
All right.
stuff.
I will thank
I've
you.
got that all over my apartment. I have half-empty bottles of water. But it is very much doing this research at the local assembly in Geneva a couple of weeks. And that's really where MHI is going to have a kind of public debut, since they've been around just about a year. But yeah, so the health industry is very
Okay. But you know, I mean, I know. But yeah, I know. But the virtual people are just I mean, I was just. I wanted to say that. I said, I keep saying for therapeutic, and he goes, it's not my fault. But he says, people are, and you know, oh my. I was emailing them, That's what he says. I said, I don't know, because I can't step in. But he says, no, you've been upped enough there that people can be. I know, and I told them all they're getting their full CEU credits. So I figured that's the main, that's their big concern.
So what we did, just so you know, is we switched to Zoom. I created a Zoom link and I'm just doing it on Zoom, and that's the way it's going to be for the rest of the time.
And then Ben something said the Zoom link worked, but then it didn't work.
That was it. Not me as a paid person, but it was a person error. Then it was okay.
So now it's okay.
Now it's fine.
But everything's being recorded. So like,
So I have to check and see if this got recorded because the live
because that's what
right. The other, he's got recorded. The main one got recorded. We're not recording in the